Summer of 1945. Southern Germany lay silent beneath a haze of dust and exhaustion. Cities that had once echoed with factory whistles and church bells now stood hollow, their streets stripped to bone and shadow. Roofs were gone, walls cracked open to the sun, and the air carried the mingled scents of ash, wet plaster, and the faint sweetness of new weeds forcing their way through broken cobblestones. In Munich, Nuremberg, and Würzburg, children wandered between the shells of buildings, collecting bits of chalk, buttons, and twisted scrap metal as if searching for fragments of a vanished world. They used the backs of bricks as blackboards and the burnt ground as paper. Some tried to write the alphabet they barely remembered, tracing letters into the soot with trembling fingers. Their lessons had ended months, sometimes years before, buried under air raids and evacuations. Across these same ruins moved men in unfamiliar uniforms marked with white stars. American soldiers, still smelling of engine oil and field rations, passed through streets where tanks had rolled only weeks earlier. Their rifles were slung loose now, their eyes drawn not to danger but to the strange quiet. Where once they had scanned windows for snipers, they now saw faces of children looking up from the rubble. The front was gone, but the devastation it left behind was endless. Whole districts had no schools, no books, no teachers, not even roofs to shield a class from rain. Education, that fragile chain linking past to future, had been broken. In the first months after Germany's surrender, few thought of lessons or classrooms. Survival came first. Families traded anything for food, searching ruins for fuel and pots. Streets were filled with carts piled high with debris, and every sound, the ring of a hammer, the creak of a wooden door, seemed part of a slow rebuilding no one quite believed in yet. The war had ended, but in many ways life still resembled an occupation by silence and loss. For the occupying forces, the question became unavoidable: what does victory mean in a place where even childhood has no shelter? In the American zone, from Bavaria to Hesse, the devastation of schools was total. Nearly half of all educational buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. Classrooms that had once displayed portraits of Hitler now gaped open to the weather. Chalkboards had been splintered for firewood. Desks were buried under bricks. Playgrounds had turned into vegetable plots. The physical collapse mirrored the moral one. Teachers who had pledged loyalty to the Nazi regime were being investigated, suspended, or imprisoned. Libraries were sealed as inspectors searched for banned or propagandist texts. For a generation of children, the concept of a classroom had become as distant as peace itself. When the American soldiers arrived, they carried no orders about rebuilding schools. Their mission was occupation, administration, and stabilization. Yet among them were engineers, medics, clerks, and chaplains who had grown up in their own small-town classrooms back home, men who had studied history in Ohio, taught mathematics in Illinois, or built gymnasiums in Texas. They understood instinctively that a country without schools would never rise again. So when they saw a boy drawing letters on the ground with a stick, or a group of girls sitting inside a shattered church reciting the multiplication table from memory, it struck them more deeply than the sight of any battlefield. In the late afternoons, when the light turned amber over the ruins, the soldiers often stopped near the skeletal remains of old schoolhouses. Dust swirled in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Somewhere nearby, a church bell still worked, ringing faintly through the hollow city. It was in moments like these that the idea began to take form, not as a command from Washington, but as a quiet realization among those on the ground, that rebuilding Germany could not begin with factories or roads, but with the return of its classrooms. The war had burned away almost everything that made daily life recognizable, but it had not erased curiosity. Children still asked questions, still followed the soldiers through the streets, pointing at trucks and badges, repeating the strange English words they heard. For the Americans, it was a mirror of what they had fought to protect, the possibility that learning could survive even after destruction. Standing in the ruins of schools that had once taught obedience and ideology, they began to see another kind of victory, one measured not in territory or treaties, but in the chance to replace fear with understanding. By that summer, the image of a child writing in the dust beneath a shattered window had become one of the quiet symbols of post-war Germany, fragile, fleeting, yet profoundly human. It was a moment between devastation and renewal, when history paused to breathe. The soldiers who watched from the edge of the rubble did not yet know that within months, they would help rebuild those same walls. They would clear the bricks, gather wood, and raise roofs where children could learn again. In a landscape emptied by war, the act of education would become the first true sign of peace. In the months following Germany's surrender in May 1945, the collapse of the Third Reich left not just a political vacuum, but a complete breakdown of the nation's educational system. Classrooms that had once shaped a generation under authoritarian ideology now lay silent or buried under stone and glass. More than half of all schools in urban centers across Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg-Baden had been destroyed or rendered unusable. Roofs had caved in, windows were shattered, and furniture was scavenged for firewood during the harsh winter of 1944–45. In the countryside, some rural schools still stood, but they had no books, no heat, and no qualified teachers. Education, the foundation of any civil society, had ceased to function. The devastation went far beyond the physical. 12 years of Nazi rule had transformed classrooms into instruments of propaganda. History had been rewritten to glorify conquest. Science had been distorted by racial ideology. Obedience had replaced curiosity as the supreme virtue. When the regime fell, so did the moral scaffolding that had held German education together, however poisoned it had been. Teachers who had pledged loyalty to Hitler were now suspended or investigated. Others, terrified of retribution, destroyed party documents or fled from their towns. The Allied Control Council required every educator to undergo denazification screening before returning to work. As a result, an estimated one-third of all teaching positions in the American zone were vacant by late 1945. The few instructors who remained were overworked, underpaid, and often struggling with their own disillusionment. Children, caught in the ruins of two worlds, wandered between survival and neglect. Some spent their days searching for food or coal, others helped parents clear debris from the streets. In cities like Frankfurt and Munich, improvised shelters replaced classrooms, and lessons, if they happened at all, took place in church basements or abandoned halls. Paper was so scarce that students wrote on scraps of wrapping material or slate fragments. The black market, not the blackboard, became the daily reality. Hunger blurred concentration, and many children showed signs of malnutrition and trauma. Diseases like typhus and diphtheria spread through the overcrowded ruins, making education seem like a distant luxury. For the American military government, the issue was more than humanitarian. The absence of functioning schools threatened the very objectives of the occupation. A defeated nation could not simply be governed through soldiers and decrees. It had to be taught, patiently, systematically, and with a new moral vocabulary. Yet how could democracy be introduced in a place where the language of free thought had been silenced for a generation? The Americans understood that rebuilding classrooms was not just a matter of replacing bricks, but of re-educating an entire society to think critically again. Without schools, there would be no framework for civic responsibility, no way to nurture citizens capable of questioning authority rather than submitting to it. The Allied Directive JCS 1067 had made this tension explicit. It instructed U.S. authorities to eliminate Nazi and militarist influences from the educational system, while simultaneously encouraging the development of democratic ideas. But this dual mission proved almost impossible at first. Purging Nazi ideology meant dismissing tens of thousands of teachers, yet creating a democratic curriculum required trained educators who simply did not exist anymore. Every decision risked deepening the vacuum. In some districts, classes reopened with no approved textbooks, and teachers relied on memory or copied lessons from old notes, carefully avoiding banned subjects. In others, schoolhouses stood repaired but empty, because there was no one left to stand at the front of the room. The deeper problem ran beneath the rubble and shortages. A generation of German children had been raised under a system that discouraged independent thought. To them, learning had always meant repetition and discipline, not questioning or imagination. Now, after years of war and propaganda, even the concept of education as a path to moral renewal seemed abstract. Many adults distrusted new authorities. They feared that American-imposed lessons would be just another form of indoctrination. The Americans, for their part, feared that ignorance would breed resentment, and that a nation left uneducated could relapse into extremism. By the end of 1945, this crisis had become one of the most urgent challenges in the American zone. A shattered physical landscape mirrored an equally fractured intellectual one. The ruins of schools were not just symbols of destruction, they were the visible proof that an entire society had lost its ability to teach itself how to live differently. Without classrooms, without teachers, and without trust, Germany risked remaining a nation of survivors unable to imagine a future. For the U.S. military government, the reconstruction of schools would soon become the first step toward rebuilding the German mind itself, a task as complex and fragile as peace. After Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, the country was divided into 4 zones of occupation, each administered by one of the Allied powers. The American zone stretched across southern and central Germany, encompassing the states of Bavaria, Württemberg-Baden, and Greater Hesse, along with the northern exclave of Bremen and its port, Bremerhaven, which served as the principal supply gateway for U.S. forces. The administrative heart of this zone was Frankfurt am Main, where the Office of Military Government, United States, OMGUS, directed the complex effort of rebuilding a society that had been dismantled by 12 years of dictatorship and 6 years of total war. The American occupation was unlike any military campaign the United States had ever conducted. Its purpose was not conquest or control, but transformation. The mission assigned to OMGUS by the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Directive JCS 1067 was explicit: to demilitarize, denazify, decentralize, and democratize Germany. American troops were to prevent the resurgence of militarism and authoritarian ideology, while simultaneously encouraging the development of democratic institutions from the ruins of the Nazi state. This balance between punishment and reconstruction, between justice and mercy, defined the early months of the occupation. The soldiers who had crossed the Rhine as conquerors now found themselves as administrators, engineers, and increasingly as teachers. The administrative structure of OMGUS reflected the complexity of its task. The headquarters oversaw 12 regional governments and hundreds of local offices scattered through towns and rural districts. Each major city had a military government detachment responsible for civil affairs, housing, food distribution, policing, public health, and education. These detachments operated in close cooperation with German local officials who had been screened and cleared of Nazi affiliation. The Americans relied heavily on these reinstated German civil servants, not because of trust, but because no occupation force could govern an entire nation without their expertise. Education quickly became one of the central concerns of OMGUS. During the Nazi era, schools had been systematically used to indoctrinate children in racial ideology and obedience to the Führer. Teachers had been organized into the National Socialist Teachers League, and curricula had been rewritten to glorify war, purity, and sacrifice. To the American authorities, the reformation of education was therefore a moral and strategic imperative. A new Germany could not be built until its youth were freed from the intellectual chains of propaganda. In August 1945, the Education and Cultural Affairs branch was established within OMGUS, staffed by American educators, sociologists, and officers with experience in public administration. Its director, John W. Taylor, a former university dean, emphasized that education should be the first workshop of democracy. The environment in which OMGUS operated was one of chaos and deprivation. The German economy had collapsed, transport networks were broken, coal and food were scarce. Millions of refugees and displaced persons were moving through the zone, straining every resource. Many German towns had no functioning government at all, and American officers were forced to make decisions on everything from sewage to schooling. In this environment, the notion of reopening classrooms might have seemed secondary, yet it quickly became clear that education was inseparable from stability. Without schools, children roamed the streets, crime increased, and communities lost a sense of purpose. For the Americans, re-establishing education was as much a security measure as a humanitarian one. The ideological framework for this work drew on precedents from earlier U.S. occupations, notably Japan, where similar plans were developing under General MacArthur, and on domestic models of civic education. American policymakers believed that democracy could be taught through practice, by decentralizing authority, encouraging debate, and rebuilding trust in local governance. This approach clashed with German traditions of hierarchy and state control in education, forcing both sides to adapt. In many places, American officers insisted that local councils participate in decisions about curriculum and teacher selection, planting the seeds of a more pluralistic system. By late 1945, the scale of the task was becoming apparent. There were more than 5 million school-age children in the American zone and fewer than half the necessary buildings intact. Over 40,000 teachers had been suspended pending denazification, and printing presses capable of producing new textbooks had been destroyed or confiscated. Yet despite these obstacles, AMBIS treated education as a priority equal to housing and food distribution. American and German officials held conferences in Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Munich to draft new educational guidelines, remove fascist content from textbooks, and outline the principles of a democratic reorientation. The occupation authorities understood that rebuilding Germany's schools would shape not only the future of a nation but also the moral outcome of the war itself. Victory on the battlefield could not endure without victory in the classroom. The historical burden of the American zone was therefore heavier than military governance alone. It was to transform a conquered enemy into a future partner, not through coercion, but through education. This realization gave the occupation a purpose beyond politics: the slow, deliberate reconstruction of the German mind and the creation of a civic culture capable of sustaining peace. By June 1945, only weeks after the guns had fallen silent, the U.S. military government began to face the immense question of how to transform its authority from one of occupation to one of reconstruction. Amidst the ruins of Bavaria and Hesse, American officers realized that the most decisive step toward rebuilding civic life was the reopening of schools. The directive had not come as a grand political order from Washington but as a series of practical decisions made in local military government detachments, where soldiers and civilian administrators were confronted daily with thousands of idle children wandering through devastated streets. What began as a logistical necessity, keeping children occupied and away from danger, soon evolved into the first act of moral reconstruction. The early initiatives were small and improvised. American officers authorized local mayors to reopen classes wherever minimal safety could be guaranteed. Basements, barns, church halls, and partially repaired buildings became temporary classrooms. In Würzburg, lessons began in the crypt of a bombed cathedral. In Darmstadt, teachers gathered pupils in the remnants of a railway office. In rural Bavaria, children sat on wooden crates beneath roofs patched with canvas from U.S. Army tents. There was no central plan at first, only the shared conviction that learning had to resume, no matter how fragile the circumstances. The first priority was elementary education. The Americans believed that younger children were less tainted by ideology and could adapt more easily to democratic values. Older students, especially those from the Hitler Youth generation, were viewed with suspicion and required closer supervision. AMBIS therefore focused its limited resources on reopening primary schools, reasoning that the psychological and civic foundations of a new Germany had to be laid early. American officials encouraged communities to nominate teachers who were known locally for decency and fairness, even if their formal qualifications were uncertain. Screening commissions reviewed these nominations, removing anyone with documented membership in Nazi organizations. The process was imperfect and slow, but it allowed thousands of classrooms to resume instruction within months. Engineering and logistics units of the U.S. Army provided critical materials support. They supplied glass, lumber, and sheet metal salvaged from military depots, along with stoves, nails, and paint. Soldiers repaired roofs, cleared debris, and restored basic utilities when local manpower was unavailable. Yet the physical labor was largely carried out by Germans themselves, men recently demobilized from the Wehrmacht, women from local communities, and municipal workers reassigned by order of the military government. For many Germans, this cooperation was their first experience of working side by side with former enemies. In a country still divided by fear and humiliation, the sight of American soldiers handing tools to German civilians carried a quiet symbolism. Reconstruction had begun not through speeches but through shared effort. To coordinate these dispersed efforts, AMGAS issued a set of provisional education guidelines in late summer 1945. They authorized the reopening of schools subject to inspection, approved emergency curricula free of militaristic or racial content, and established regional education officers to oversee implementation. These officers, many of them educators or linguists before the war, traveled constantly through the zone, inspecting classrooms, distributing supplies, and reporting on progress. Their dispatches described scenes both hopeful and heartbreaking: children studying by candlelight, teachers conducting lessons without books, blackboards made from tarred planks. The response from German communities was immediate. Parents volunteered to clean ruins, women organized sewing circles to make satchels and clothes for students, and farmers contributed food for school lunches. In Munich, citizens cleared rubble from the yard of a former technical school, rebuilding it brick by brick with guidance from an American engineer. In Stuttgart, a local pastor opened his church hall for classes, and the U.S. detachment provided benches from an abandoned barracks. These acts of cooperation were modest, but they carried immense psychological weight. Each repaired window, each restored desk became a small assertion that normal life was possible again. The catalyst for this transformation was not a single order, but a gradual change in perception. American soldiers and administrators, initially trained for control, began to see reconstruction as their real duty. German civilians, initially resigned to punishment, discovered that rebuilding could be an act of dignity. The reopening of schools crystallized this shift. It offered both sides a space where authority and trust could coexist, where the conqueror taught by enabling the conquered to teach themselves. By the end of 1945, hundreds of schools across the American zone were once again holding daily lessons. The war had turned classrooms into rubble, but the cooperation that emerged from those ruins became the first living proof that peace could be built not merely by treaties, but by shared purpose. The process of rebuilding Germany's educational system in the American zone unfolded slowly, but with remarkable precision and persistence. After the first emergency reopenings in mid-1945, AMGAS sought to transform scattered local efforts into a coherent administrative structure. By the autumn of that year, each of the major states within the zone, Bavaria, Württemberg-Baden, and Greater Hesse, had established its own Ministry of Education operating under supervision of the U.S. military government. These land education offices were composed of a mix of German officials who had passed denazification screening and American liaison officers responsible for enforcing occupation directives. The Americans avoided direct management of day-to-day teaching. Instead, they shaped policy through guidelines, inspections, and the power to approve or veto personnel and curricula. At the core of this process stood the denazification and retraining of teachers. Under Nazi rule, more than 97% of educators had belonged to the National Socialist Teachers League. Removing all of them would have made schooling impossible, yet ignoring their past would have compromised the moral foundation of Reconstruction. AMGAS therefore designed a tiered review system. Local screening committees examined teachers' political histories, while regional boards made final judgments. Those found to have been active propagandists were dismissed permanently. Others with minor affiliations could be reinstated after attending short re-education courses. These courses, conducted in makeshift seminar rooms and university halls in Munich, Stuttgart, and Frankfurt, introduced teachers to concepts of civic responsibility, freedom of conscience, and democratic participation. By early 1946, several thousand instructors had completed these programs and returned to classrooms, forming the first nucleus of a reformed profession. Rebuilding the physical infrastructure demanded equally careful planning. School buildings were surveyed and classified according to the extent of damage. U.S. Army engineers provided blueprints and technical guidance, but German municipal authorities handled most of the construction using local materials. Bricks salvaged from ruins, wooden beams from dismantled barracks, and tarpaulins from army stockpiles were turned into walls, roofs, and temporary windows. Where entire buildings were beyond repair, classes met outdoors or under canvas shelters. It was common in 1945 to 46 to see lessons taking place in courtyards or half-destroyed halls, with children wearing coats through winter months and teachers writing on blackened walls that had survived the bombing. The creation of new teaching materials posed an intellectual challenge as serious as the physical one. In August 1945, Omdis ordered the confiscation of all textbooks produced under the Nazi regime. Only a handful of pre-1933 works, mostly in mathematics and basic science, were deemed acceptable. To fill the vacuum, regional textbook commissions were formed in Bavaria, Württemberg-Baden, and Greater Hesse. These groups, composed of German scholars, teachers, and American advisors, reviewed every subject for ideological content. Passages glorifying war or racial theory were removed, references to the Führer and the national community were cut out page by page. Entire sections on history and biology were rewritten from the ground up. Printing was limited by shortages of paper and ink, so the first, clean, textbooks were often mimeographed or handwritten in small batches. Some schools used collective notebooks, where the teacher copied one version of a lesson and students transcribed it by hand. Material shortages forced constant improvisation. Paper, chalk, and pencils were distributed through the U.S. Army's civil affairs depots. Local communities supplied whatever they could: furniture, heating stoves, or glass panes. Parents scavenged metal frames to make desks, and carpenters converted ammunition boxes into benches. American field warehouses released surplus tarpaulins, blankets, and lamps to provide shelter and light. In cities like Nuremberg and Augsburg, U.S. trucks delivered crates of notebooks stamped for civilian use, a rare sign of abundance amid general scarcity. The process was not efficient, but it was relentless, driven by the conviction that routine itself was part of recovery. Every morning, classes began at precisely 8 o'clock, even if there was no clock, no bell, and no roof. Teachers insisted on order and continuity, believing that discipline, once a tool of oppression, could now serve the rebuilding of character. Inspectors from Omdis noted in their reports that despite freezing temperatures and empty stomachs, attendance rates among children were exceptionally high. To them, the classroom represented more than instruction. It was a space of safety, the first stable rhythm in a landscape of uncertainty. By early 1946, the administrative scaffolding of the new school system was largely in place. German land ministries handled curricula, examinations, and salaries, while American advisors monitored compliance with democratic reforms. The Education and Cultural Affairs branch in Frankfurt coordinated communication between the zones and ensured that policies in one state could inform another. Step by step, the process moved from survival to structure, from emergency lessons in ruins to the deliberate rebuilding of an educational order founded not on ideology, but on civic responsibility and intellectual freedom. By the beginning of 1946, the fragile network of reopened schools in the American zone had entered its first true test. The structures were standing, the lessons had begun, but the question remained whether this new system could function under real conditions, in a country still starving, grieving, and divided by guilt. Every classroom became a small experiment in re-education, and every teacher stood at the intersection of two eras, one that had taught obedience, and one that now demanded independent thought. The shortage of qualified educators reached a critical point. Denazification had stripped entire regions of their teaching core. In some districts of Bavaria, less than 30% of pre-war teachers remained in service. Thousands of others were awaiting clearance, or had been permanently banned. To fill the gap, the land education offices recruited anyone with basic qualifications: university students, retired civil servants, nuns, nurses, or women who had once attended teacher training schools before the war. For many of them, standing before a class again was both an act of courage and an act of defiance against the past. The U.S. military government's Education and Cultural Affairs branch, directed by John W. Taylor, oversaw this delicate transition. It issued standardized examination forms, visited schools, and collected monthly reports from regional education officers. Taylor's department emphasized not indoctrination but method, the way subjects were taught, the spirit of inquiry encouraged, and the respect for truth restored. Teachers were instructed to replace rote memorization with discussion, to treat history as a moral inquiry rather than a national myth. To ensure that these changes were real, American inspectors attended lessons unannounced, sitting quietly in the back with notebooks, recording what they saw. Their reports often described cold classrooms filled with determination, children huddled in coats, teachers with hoarse voices reading from handwritten notes, and a faint smell of smoke from makeshift stoves. The first courses for democratic retraining had already begun in the autumn of 1945. In Munich, Frankfurt, and Stuttgart, short-term seminars of 4 to 6 weeks brought together teachers from across the zone. American educators and German professors who had opposed the Nazi regime lectured on civic education, comparative history, and ethics. The tone was cautious but hopeful. These courses did not attempt to erase the past, that would have been impossible, but to rebuild confidence in reason and dialogue. Graduates returned to their schools carrying mimeograph lesson plans on topics such as the rights of the individual, the separation of powers, and the value of scientific honesty. For many, it was the first time in their lives that they were encouraged to question authority rather than to submit to it. In the field, results varied widely. Rural schools often performed better than those in cities simply because they had fewer destroyed buildings and smaller classes. In urban centers like Nuremberg or Frankfurt, overcrowding was severe. Some classrooms held up to 70 pupils, divided into morning and afternoon shifts. Hunger and cold remained constant obstacles. Teachers tried to keep lessons short to conserve energy, and many collapsed from exhaustion or illness. Despite these hardships, attendance remained astonishingly high, a sign that both children and parents understood the symbolic weight of returning to school. The new curricula faced their own trials. History lessons, once centered on battles and heroes, now turned toward civic life and global responsibility. Textbooks were inconsistent and scarce, forcing teachers to improvise from memory or translate articles from American magazines distributed by the Information Control Division. In subjects like biology, instructors struggled to replace the pseudoscientific racial theories that had dominated the previous decade with empirical observation and moral reflection. American officers occasionally provided supplementary materials, maps, charts, even film strips, to illustrate these new approaches. In some towns, portable projectors from army libraries were used to screen educational films about democracy, hygiene, or geography. Inspections revealed that progress was uneven but tangible. Omnibus reports from late 1946 recorded thousands of functioning schools and hundreds of thousands of enrolled students. Yet the quality of teaching varied sharply. Some instructors reverted to authoritarian habits, enforcing strict discipline and rote recitation. Others embraced open discussion and student councils. The military government tolerated these inconsistencies, preferring gradual evolution over forced conformity. The goal was not to impose an American model but to awaken a German one capable of self-renewal. The daily scene of instruction became a living metaphor for the country's condition. Soldiers and civilians often shared the same buildings, one floor housing a military office, another filled with children reciting arithmetic. A soldier might pause outside a classroom door, listening to the faint rhythm of a lesson rising through the dust. The contrast between the war that had ended and the learning that had just begun was stark. Yet in that fragile coexistence lay the first evidence that education could survive even in a defeated land, that the language of violence could slowly give way to the language of thought. By the end of 1946, the effort to rebuild education in the American occupation zone had begun to show measurable results. What had started as scattered attempts in ruined towns now formed a functioning network of schools across Bavaria, Württemberg-Baden, and Greater Hesse. Official reports from the U.S. military government recorded that over 3/4 of all primary schools were once again open, serving millions of children. The buildings were far from comfortable. Many still lacked glass in the windows, heating stoves were scarce, and desks were patched together from salvaged wood, yet they operated daily. Lessons resumed through frost and hunger, often with children writing in notebooks made from recycled paper or on slates passed down from older siblings. In this bleak environment, the mere routine of school life carried immense symbolic power. It was evidence that German society was learning, quite literally, to stand again. One of the most visible effects of the Reconstruction was the emergence of school feeding programs. Malnutrition among children had reached critical levels during the winter of 1945–46, when the average caloric intake in many parts of Germany fell below subsistence. To combat starvation and encourage attendance, the military government, with the support of international relief agencies, introduced organized meal distribution through the schools. The first large-scale initiative was coordinated by Kralog, the Council of Relief Agencies licensed to operate in Germany, formed in early 1946 as a joint effort of American charities and churches. Working under AMGA's supervision, Kralog shipped tons of dried milk, beans, flour, and fats through the port of Bremerhaven, distributing them to school kitchens across the U.S. zone. The American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, a Quaker organization, played a particularly crucial role in setting up local soup kitchens and school canteens. By spring 1946, in cities like Stuttgart, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg, thousands of children received a daily portion of hot soup, estimated at roughly 300 calories. Though meager, these meals were often the only reliable food of the day. Teachers were tasked with maintaining order during distribution, and children lined up with tin cups and enamel bowls, waiting patiently in the cold. For them, the act of eating together inside a school building symbolized the return of community and trust. That same summer, the arrival of care packages added another layer to the humanitarian network. Authorized in June 1946, the first shipments reached Germany through Bremerhaven and Bremen in August. Each package contained staples like powdered milk, sugar, chocolate, and canned meat, all donated by American citizens. Though originally intended for families, many were redirected to schools to support the feeding program. American soldiers helped unload and transport the supplies, while local volunteers managed distribution. These packages, stamped "From the American People," became tangible tokens of goodwill, bridging the emotional gap between conqueror and conquered. Later in 1946, former U.S. President Herbert Hoover was appointed by President Truman as a special representative to coordinate global food relief. Hoover's post-war mission brought additional shipments of grain and milk powder to Germany, supplementing the school feeding system through the winter of 1946–47, a period remembered as one of the harshest in decades. His involvement lent both authority and moral weight to the humanitarian dimension of the occupation, reinforcing the idea that rebuilding Germany required more than punishment or political reform. It required nourishment. The spread of these programs had immediate social consequences. Attendance in primary schools rose sharply as families realized that education now guaranteed not only learning but survival. In some towns, enrollment exceeded pre-war levels. Teachers, despite low pay and exhaustion, noted visible improvements in children's health and attention once regular meals were introduced. The school thus evolved from a mere place of instruction into a center of stability, where basic needs were met and a sense of order returned. Beyond nutrition, the influence of the educational reforms began to extend into culture and public life. Local newspapers, often re-established under Allied licenses, featured stories about reopened schools, exhibitions of student drawings, and community performances held in repaired auditoriums. These events were modest but deeply symbolic. They showed that creative and civic life could flourish even in ruins. By 1947, the first teacher associations and parent committees had formed, supported by the education branch of AMGAS, which viewed such participation as essential to democratic development. The impact of the American educational initiative spread not only through policy but through perception. For many Germans, the sight of U.S. soldiers delivering milk to a school or inspecting a repaired roof contradicted years of propaganda that had portrayed the Allies as destroyers. Acts of assistance replaced fear with gratitude, and classrooms became the first public spaces where the idea of partnership between occupier and occupied took root. The return of school life, however fragile, however improvised, became one of the most powerful symbols of post-war renewal. It proved that recovery could begin not with grand declarations, but with a bowl of soup, a stack of books, and the quiet determination of children learning again amid the ruins. By the late 1940s, the work begun in the ruins of the American Zone had matured into something far greater than emergency reconstruction. From the shattered classrooms of 1945 emerged the first post-war generation of West Germany, a generation shaped not by ideology but by the quiet persistence of learning. The children who had sat on broken benches and written with borrowed pencils would, 2 decades later, become engineers, doctors, and professors in a country transformed from a symbol of devastation into one of recovery. The seeds planted in those improvised schools were already germinating, even if no one at the time could yet see what kind of nation they would grow into. The immediate legacy of the educational reforms was institutional. Between 1947 and 1949, with encouragement and financial assistance from AMBIS, each state in the American Zone established permanent teacher training centers and pedagogical institutes. In Munich, the newly reopened University of Munich created a faculty dedicated to democratic education and civic studies. Similar programs appeared in Stuttgart and Gießen, supported by German educators who had survived the purges and returned with renewed purpose. These institutions replaced the rigid hierarchies of the old Lehrerbildungsanstalten, the Nazi-era teachers' academies, with flexible systems that emphasized moral judgment, psychology, and social responsibility. The very process of training teachers had become a mirror of the democratic values the Americans sought to instill: discussion instead of dogma, initiative instead of obedience. The changes also extended beyond classrooms. School councils, parent committees, and local education boards were encouraged to participate in decision-making, a striking departure from Germany's long tradition of centralized control. The Americans insisted that democracy had to be practiced, not merely taught. As a result, by 1948, hundreds of communities had formed advisory groups that discussed curriculum, resource allocation, and even extracurricular activities. For parents who had lived through years of propaganda and censorship, the opportunity to voice opinions about their children's education felt revolutionary. In these modest gatherings, often held in unheated schoolrooms, the habits of civic life were quietly reborn. The symbolic dimension of this transformation was equally significant. In diaries and letters preserved from that period, many German parents expressed disbelief that their former enemies were now repairing their children's schools. "We expected vengeance," one woman from Würzburg wrote, "but received help instead." This sense of astonishment became one of the emotional foundations of post-war reconciliation. For many Germans, the American soldier with a hammer or a bag of supplies embodied a new kind of power, one that rebuilt instead of destroyed. The image contrasted sharply with the propaganda that had portrayed the Allies as ruthless conquerors. In a society exhausted by guilt and grief, acts of generosity carried a moral resonance stronger than any speech. By the time the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in 1949, the educational structures established under the U.S. occupation had already become the backbone of the new state's school system. The decentralized model, the emphasis on civic instruction, and the separation of education from political influence were all direct legacies of the AMBIS period. The textbooks approved in 1946 and revised again in 1948 remained in use for years, shaping the worldview of millions of students. Even after the American administration withdrew, the idea that knowledge should serve peace, not power, endured as the unspoken philosophy of the classroom. Culturally, the post-war schools became incubators of dialogue between Germany and the West. Exchange programs and English language instruction, encouraged by the Americans, opened new intellectual horizons. Universities rebuilt with Marshall Plan funds expanded opportunities for higher learning. Libraries once burned by ideology were restocked with foreign literature and science texts. The children who had grown up under these influences entered adulthood in the 1950s as citizens of a democratic state, bearing little resemblance to the generation that had preceded them. Their sense of responsibility and skepticism toward authority became defining features of West German society in the decades that followed. The legacy of those years could be measured not only in institutions but in attitudes. Education had ceased to be a tool of the state and had become a safeguard against its excesses. teachers learned to see themselves not as servants of authority but as guardians of conscience. For the Americans who had overseen the transformation, this outcome validated their most ambitious hope, that democracy, once taught, could take root even in the soil of defeat. The schoolhouses they had helped to rebuild stood as quiet monuments to that belief, places where the voices of children replaced the echo of commands, and where knowledge, not force, became the foundation of peace. In the years that followed the war, the reconstruction of German schools revealed a truth that no treaty or tribunal could express, that the measure of victory was not destruction, but restoration. The process of reopening classrooms, repairing roofs, and rewriting textbooks had grown into something deeper than policy. It had become a moral experiment in rebuilding humanity itself. The United States, once the enemy across the battlefield, had chosen an approach rare in the history of conquest. It had demonstrated that to defeat a totalitarian idea, one must replace it not with domination, but with understanding. In a land where every brick carried the memory of guilt, the sound of children's voices returned as a kind of absolution. Those voices did not erase the past, but they proved that the future could speak a different language. The schools built among the ruins stood as small monuments to the possibility of renewal, their cracked walls holding not just lessons in arithmetic or grammar, but lessons in dignity. For the German people, the act of sending children to learn under the supervision of former enemies was itself an act of faith, a belief that knowledge could heal where punishment could not. The philosophy behind this quiet transformation rested on an idea that education was the most powerful form of disarmament. Where weapons could only silence, teaching could reshape the mind that once believed in violence. Every blackboard, every repaired classroom became a field of peace more enduring than any occupied territory. American officers who had arrived as conquerors found themselves transformed into guardians of learning, their authority defined not by command but by the trust of civilians who had once feared them. Through this shared labor, the boundary between victor and defeated blurred, replaced by a fragile mutual respect. For Germany, the return of its schools marked the rediscovery of moral gravity. The generation raised in these post-war classrooms learned that obedience without conscience had led to catastrophe, and that freedom carried responsibilities as weighty as any uniform. In lessons on civics and ethics, in debates about justice and history, children absorbed the foundations of a democratic culture that would one day define the Federal Republic. They were taught not only to remember what had happened, but to question why it had been allowed to happen, an education in vigilance as much as in knowledge. The American project in education was not without flaws, yet its enduring impact lay in its refusal to reduce victory to humiliation. The rebuilding of schools symbolized a new form of power, one that did not conquer bodies but sought to awaken minds. It replaced the architecture of fear with the architecture of trust. In this sense, the schoolhouse became the true opposite of the concentration camp, a place where the value of life was affirmed daily through learning, curiosity, and dialogue. By the early 1950s, as Germany entered a new political era, many of the soldiers and educators who had participated in the early reconstruction returned home. They left behind no statues, no triumphal arches, only the ordinary rhythm of lessons and exams, the laughter of children in courtyards once filled with rubble. Yet those sounds were the quietest and most profound legacy of the war's end. They marked not the victory of one nation over another, but the victory of civilization over barbarism. In retrospect, the reconstruction of German education stood as a reminder that peace is not simply the absence of war, but the deliberate cultivation of thought, compassion, and responsibility. America's greatest achievement in post-war Europe was not material, it was philosophical. It proved that rebuilding a society begins with the rebuilding of its conscience. The children who filled those early classrooms were the first citizens of a new Germany, one born not from fear of defeat, but from gratitude for a second chance. And in their lessons, in the quiet act of learning, the post-war world discovered that humanism could outlast the ruins of any empire.